Okay, so I'm showing you this not because you need to know it, but because you don't need to know it, so that you realize these are all of the different phylum names, so classification for fungus. They're big old long names. Fungus many times are classified by the kind of spores they produce and so forth. I am not going to hold you responsible for any of these phylum names. So we're going to cover fungus a little bit more practically, like how we use it and what are some functions of fungus in the environment instead of classification, because that's a little boring for you, and also some big, huge names. So we're going to look at the fungi by types in terms of where you find them, what they're doing, and so forth. So of course, many fungi are saprobes or saprotrophs. Okay, so they feed on dead organisms or waste, break it down externally, absorb what they need, leave the rest in the environment. We also have fungi that are considered symbionts, meaning that they live together with another organism. And if it's mutualistic, then they both benefit. Okay, so the fungus benefits in some way, and the organism that it lives with also benefits. But we also do have fungi that are parasitic, meaning that they are living with a living organism or host, and they're causing harm to that host. They're getting something good from it, but they cause harm to the host organism that they live with. Okay, so this is kind of review because we've talked about it, but kind of gives you a figure of how to kind of see this in your head. So fungi get carbon. So carbon is an organic source of energy. Okay, and so organic sources could be rotting leaves, it could be rotting trees, it could be dead bacteria in the soil, it could be any number of different organisms that have died. Okay, that's where they get their carbon from. But you see that enzymes are released from the end of the hypha. And those enzymes break down whatever is in that area, and then the organism, the fungus, will then absorb what it needs and leave the rest for whatever other organisms are in that soil. So just pictures, examples. So maybe you recognize mold here. So we have mold on these fruits. You have mold growing in a home that probably had some flood damage. We have bracket fungus growing on trees. So you can find these fungi and decomposers in lots of different areas, and they don't all look exactly the same. I believe this picture was from one of the previous hurricanes down in Houston, where there was a lot of rain and a lot of flooding. And so if there are spores in the water, there are spores on the surface with all that water, they germinate, and then you start to have this mold growing on the walls and the ceilings. And the issue with that is that some of those fungal spores are pathogenic, and they're not good for your respiratory system and things like that, and so mold really needs to be removed so it doesn't cause respiratory issues. So black bread mold is another example. I'm not worried that you know this life cycle. That's not so important to me, but I do want you to realize that if you pull out a piece of bread or a bagel or whatever it is out of the bag that you have in your pantry and you see mold growing on it, this type of mold, it's decomposing, but it's not going to make you sick. I don't know if you've ever accidentally eaten a piece of bread that had mold growing on it, but usually it tastes a little bit like dirt because the mold is beginning to decompose the organic material in that bread. So it doesn't taste great, but it's not going to kill you. Okay? And think about, too, how that happens. If you buy a loaf of bread from the store and it's fresh bread, you may see mold growing on it in 5 or 6 days. Remember that the loaf of bread had to be put into the plastic bag and then the plastic bag had to be closed, but there's the possibility that spores flew in before you closed the bag, and the longer that bread sits around in the dark kind of moist environment of your pantry, you're probably going to start to grow some mold. So just another picture. So all the white here would just be hyphae. And as it begins to reproduce, then you're going to see the black, which would be the spores that are produced from the hyphae on that black bread mold. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of symbiotic relationships. So if we call it a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, then basically these two different species of organisms are living together and they both are getting a positive result. So they're both contributing positively to each other. So it's mutualistic. So the first example here is the lichens. And I know I mentioned them for some of you that might have been in my 1408 class. We talked a little bit about lichens. But they are a relationship between a fungus. It's always going to be a fungus partner and then an autotrophic partner, which could either be cyanobacteria or could be algae. So lichens are important because when we say they're colonizers of disturbed soils, when a fire has gone through and wiped out a forest or lava has come through and wiped out areas, some of the first organisms to begin to grow there and start to break the soil down and make it so that actually other organisms can grow there are lichens. And so they start the process of an ecosystem coming back. They're also indicators of good air quality. So if you have lichens growing in, on the trees on your campus or in your yard, that means that there's pretty good air quality because they're not going to be able to grow where there's a lot of polluted air. So on trees in maybe downtown Dallas, you're probably not going to see as many lichens growing on the trees as you would see maybe if we were actually on our campus in Hearst, where pollution is a little bit lighter. So diagrams here, this of course is just a drawing, but you can see that there's fungal hyphae surrounding algae cells or surrounding cyanobacteria cells. These are some different pictures of what the fungi or what the lichens look like. They're different colors. They usually grow pretty flat on a tree trunk or on a rock. And here, this is a lot of times what it looks like growing on a rock or something like that. And so I'm going to have you guys look at lichens when we do our garden exercise, which we'll talk about probably next week. So we're talking about fungi as symbionts, so they can live together with algae or with cyanobacteria and form lichens, which is what we're looking at here. But they can also live with other organisms. So we're going to look at an example with them living with ants. Oh, I forgot. We're going to do the mycorrhizal fungi first. So I have 3 examples of fungi as symbionts. So in mycorrhizal fungi, myco, remember, means fungus, and rhiza has to do with roots. So mycorrhizal fungi live together with plant roots, and so it's a combination of plants and fungus. Okay, so in this picture here, you can see the darker one is the plant root, but it has all of these fungi living around it, and basically what that does for the plant is it helps increase surface area so that the plant is able to take better use of both the water and the nutrients in the soil where it's living. So it's very helpful to fungi or to plants to have fungi helping them take up nutrients. This video that I put in right here is, I believe, from the University of Oklahoma. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but I think it's an interesting look at these fungi. And it also, in this video, mentions the fact that many plants have grown to need these mycorrhizal fungi. So if you transplant them and put them in soil that doesn't have the mycorrhizal fungi, they don't grow very well at all. So many plants actually have to have that partner to help them actually be able to grow well. So when we say they're extremely important ecologically, that's what we're talking about. In the ecosystem, in the ecology, which we'll talk about a little bit in lab in a couple of weeks, a lot of plants really almost require having these mycorrhizal fungi to help them grow. So they're very important in that way. So if we look at these different pots, just to show planted at exactly the same time in 3 different pots. The pot on the left had no mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, and the pot on the right had a lot of mycorrhizal fungi. So it's growing much faster and bigger and more leaves, and it's much healthier than the one without any. And the guy in the middle had a modest amount. So you can see the difference with and without. And even if you have a little bit, it's going to increase growth. Okay? If we look at these two, looking at the underground root system, if you have the mycorrhizal fungi, you don't have to have quite as big of a root system because the fungi are going to help you and you don't have to make so many little tiny roots. Okay, so couple of videos here, and I didn't put a lot of notes in your outline right here, but if you want to take a couple of notes here, and then I really suggest that you watch this video. It's a really good illustration of how the ants and the fungus live together. So leafcutter ants you can find in the tropical rainforest, but I've seen them out in East Texas and different places here in the United States. So what they have, these really sharp incisors on their jaws that help them be able to cut up leaves. So they climb the tree, cut little pieces of leaf from the leaves on the trees, and they take them back underground to their mushroom garden. So basically what they're doing is they are feeding the mushroom garden with leaves, and the mushroom garden basically provides them their food. So they harvest the mushroom, and that's part of what they eat, but they're also feeding the mushroom garden. Okay, and so that's what the leaves are used for. In the video, they talk about the fact that you don't want anything decomposing or destroying your mushroom garden if you're a leafcutter ant. And so there actually is a third partner in this relationship, and that is bacteria that produce antibiotics. And so the ants actually carry around the bacteria on their bodies that produce antibiotics to make sure that there's no bacteria coming in and destroying the mushroom garden. So you can see that nature is pretty complicated, and all of these things work together to keep all of the organisms in balance.